Hi there. Tonight we journey back to a time when childhood, as you know it, was often a fleeting whisper, a brief prelude to the stark realities of adult life. Imagine a world without playgrounds, without endless summer vacations, without the luxury of simply being a kid. Instead, you find yourself, perhaps barely a teenager, standing on the precipice of a future already decided for you. A future woven into the intricate tapestry of family ambition and societal expectation. You're about to be plunged into a life that demands maturity far beyond your years. A life where playthings are replaced by household duties and innocence is swiftly shed for the weighty responsibilities of marriage. You might think your biggest concern right now is remembering where you put your phone or what you're having for breakfast tomorrow, but back then, your concerns would have been far more existential. The survival of your family, the security of your future, and perhaps the identity of the stranger you're about to marry. It's a reality check, for sure, and you probably won't survive this particular historical detour with your modern sensibilities entirely intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe it only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? It's always fun to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a medieval village, or perhaps a lord's manor. The air thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. You're young, perhaps 12 or 13. An age when today you'd be worrying about school projects or the latest TikTok challenge. But in your medieval skin, that youthful freedom is already a distant memory, a faint echo of simpler days. For many, childhood wasn't a separate stage of life, but merely a short preparatory period before the inevitable plunge into adulthood. There was no concept of a prolonged adolescence. You were a child, then, almost overnight, you were expected to be an adult with all the accompanying duties and expectations. Historians still argue whether medieval children were even perceived as children in the same way we define the term today, or if they were simply miniature adults in training. Your days aren't filled with lessons from a benevolent teacher unless you're one of the incredibly rare elite girls destined for a convent or a highly specific political role. Instead, you're learning domestic skills, practical knowledge essential for running a household, skills that will soon become your primary occupation. You're helping with the cooking, the spinning, perhaps tending to the small garden. These aren't hobbies, they are vital contributions to your family's survival. And while you might occasionally sneak off to chase a stray chicken or giggle with a friend, the overarching narrative of your life is already being written by others. Your parents or your guardians are meticulously planning your future, weighing options, calculating advantages, all with one goal in mind: a good marriage. Consider the mainstream historical fact that the average life expectancy in medieval Europe was significantly lower than today, often in the 30s or 40s. This stark reality permeated every aspect of life, including the timing of marriages. There was a constant urgency to ensure the continuation of the family line, to produce heirs, and to secure alliances before disease or conflict swept away an entire generation. It wasn't about finding your soulmate or developing your personal growth. It was about propagation and preservation. A quirky or fringe tidbit you might find interesting is that in some regions, the legal definition of adulthood for girls was tied not just to age, but to the onset of menstruation, a very physical, an undeniable marker of reproductive readiness. regardless of emotional or intellectual maturity. This biological milestone, often occurring around 12 to 14, was seen as the signal that a girl was physically capable of bearing children, and thus capable of marriage. The concept of childhood as a protected, distinct phase of development, rich with play and education, is a relatively modern invention. For you, the medieval girl, it's simply a prelude to work, responsibility, and almost inevitably, marriage. The fleeting moments of innocent play you might snatch are precious because you instinctively know they are numbered. The transition isn't gradual, it's a sudden, often jarring, leap. One day you're a child, the next you're a bride, with a whole new set of expectations and duties thrust upon your small, unprepared shoulders. As you stand on the cusp of this predetermined future, you learn about the rules that govern your life. Rules codified not just by local custom, but by the formidable canon law of the Church. This isn't just about what your parents decide. It's about what God, through his earthly representatives, has decreed. The mainstream historical fact here is that canon law, while appearing to set minimum ages, often clashed with the practical realities of medieval life. It dictated that a valid marriage contract could be made for children above the age of 7. Yes, you heard that right, 7. Imagine being old enough to lose your first tooth, maybe, and already having your marriage written into a contract. Of course, the law then stipulated that the marriage wouldn't be fully valid or consummated until the parties reached the age of consent, which was set at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. This distinction is a quirky or fringe tidbit. A pre-contract, a promise, could bind you long before you were physically or mentally ready for the actual union. It was like buying a house when you're 7, knowing you can't move in until you're 12. So, while you might hear tales of girls married at 7, it was often a betrothal, a legally binding promise. But that promise was as good as gold, or rather, as good as an unbreakable chain. You were, effectively, off the market, and your parents weren't usually waiting for you to hit 12 before they started looking. They were looking from the moment you were old enough to sit still at a feast. Historians still argue whether the spirit of consent was truly considered in these arrangements. Given the immense pressures on young people, was it really consent if dissent meant poverty or social ruin for your entire family? Probably not. You might giggle nervously with your friends about what it means to be married, but the adults around you discuss it with the solemnity of a trade deal. For them, it is precisely that. There's no talk of grand gestures or whispered sweet nothings. Your feelings, your fears, your hopes for a different life, these are irrelevant. Your primary purpose, as articulated by the very fabric of society, is to become a wife and mother, to perpetuate your family line, and to secure its position. You're not quite a person with independent desires. You're more of a valuable piece on the chessboard of dynastic ambition. The harsh reality often superseded the minimum ages set by canon law. While a girl might not be legally married before 12, the arrangements, the promises, and the transfer of dowry could begin much, much earlier. And for many, the actual wedding ceremony followed swiftly upon reaching that 12th birthday. Sometimes, even if the girl's physical development lagged, it was a race against time, against potential family misfortunes, against the ever-present threat of early death. Your family isn't waiting for you to finish your education or discover your passion. They're waiting for you to be legally old enough to start bringing in those much-needed alliances. Think about the absurdity of it. A legal framework designed by adult men, mostly celibate priests, determining the marital fate of children. It's like me, a voice in your head, trying to explain quantum physics to a squirrel. The concepts are there, but the understanding, well, that's another story. And yet this was the framework that dictated the lives of millions of young girls across medieval Europe. You, as a child bride, were stepping into a system that had little regard for your personal readiness, prioritizing instead the complex machinations of power and survival. With the legalities of canon law now firmly in your mind, you begin to grasp the crushing reality that your marriage, when it happens, will have absolutely nothing to do with fluttering hearts or stolen glances. Forget the romantic ballads sung by wandering minstrels. Your future is being meticulously crafted, not in a garden of roses, but in the chilly halls of power. The mainstream historical fact is clear. Political and economic considerations were the primary drivers behind child marriages, far outweighing any notion of love or affection. You are not marrying for personal fulfillment. You are marrying for alliance, for land, for heirs, for strategic advantage. It's like a high-stakes game of Monopoly, and you're the deed to boardwalk. Your family's status, their wealth, their very survival in a turbulent world often depended on forging strong connections with other powerful families. Marriage was the most effective and often the only way to solidify these bonds. Imagine your father, perhaps a minor lord, looking at a map, not for new hunting grounds, but for neighboring estates, calculating the benefits of uniting his modest lands with a more prominent family through your union. Or perhaps your family holds a key trade route, and marrying you off to a merchant family from a bustling city could secure lucrative new markets. It's all about leverage, about future generations, about staying one step ahead of famine, war, or ruin. This perspective reveals a quirky or fringe tidbit. Sometimes these marriage negotiations involved incredibly detailed clauses about what would happen if either party died prematurely, especially before the marriage was consummated or children were born. It was like an ancient prenuptial agreement, but infinitely more morbid and practical, ensuring the investment wasn't lost even if you or your intended croaked before the vows were fully exchanged. Historians still argue whether parents felt genuine emotional conflict over these forced arrangements, or if societal norms had so desensitized them that they truly saw their children as expendable pawns in a larger game. It's a debate that pits our modern understanding of parental love against the harsh necessities of medieval survival. You might secretly dream of a handsome knight, strong and brave, who would sweep you off your feet, but the reality is likely to be an older man, perhaps someone you've never met, whose reputation is based on his landholdings or military prowess, not his charm. He might even be a widower with children already, in which case your role extends to stepmother from day one. There's a subtle, almost dark humor in the situation. You're getting a spouse, but you're also potentially inheriting a ready-made family and all its accompanying dramas. Congratulations, you're not just a wife, you're a bonus parent. The pressure isn't just from your immediate family, it's from the entire community. Marriage is a public affair, a statement of intent, and a solidification of social order. Everyone knows who is marrying whom, and the success or failure of the union reflects on both families. You are not just marrying an individual, you are marrying a lineage, a reputation, and a network of obligations. The sheer weight of this responsibility, placed upon shoulders that are still growing, is immense. You are expected to adapt, to integrate, and to thrive, not for your own sake, but for the collective good of your new and old families. It's a far cry from the modern concept of marrying for love, where the primary unit is the couple. Here, the primary unit is the family, and you are a carefully chosen, often reluctant, bond. Now that you've grasped the strategic role of your future marriage, let's talk about the price tag attached to your very existence, the dowry. This wasn't some optional wedding gift. It was often the linchpin of the entire arrangement. The MAINSTREAM historical fact is that the dowry was a significant transfer of wealth, goods, or property from the bride's family to the groom's, crucial for establishing the new household and securing the bride's status within it. It was your family's investment in your future, but also, paradoxically, a payment to take you off their hands. Think of it as a medieval trust fund, except it usually went directly to your husband or his family, and you rarely had direct control. Over it, you might imagine a chest brimming with gold coins, shimmering silks, or perhaps a prized cow. In reality, a dowry could take many forms: land, livestock, household goods, even ready cash if your family was exceptionally wealthy. For your family, assembling this dowry could be a monumental task, often requiring years of saving, selling off assets, or even borrowing. It was a tangible representation of their social standing and their commitment to the marriage. A larger dowry could secure a more advantageous match, a higher-ranking husband, or a more influential family. Conversely, a small or non-existent dowry often meant limited options, potentially a less desirable match, or even no marriage at all, leaving a girl vulnerable and dependent. This system presents a quirky or fringe tidbit. Sometimes the dowry was so substantial that it could actually shift power dynamics within the new household. If your dowry was particularly impressive, it might grant you, or at least your family, a degree of leverage or respect within your husband's family that a less endowed bride might not receive. It's like bringing a fancy new gadget to a group of friends. Suddenly, everyone wants to be your friend, or at least wants a turn with the gadget. Historians still argue whether the dowry fundamentally empowered women by granting them a form of economic security, or if it merely commodified them, making them transferable assets in a patriarchal system. The debate highlights the complex and often contradictory nature of women's roles in the medieval economy. For you, the child bride, the dowry is a constant background hum of conversation. You hear whispers about how much your father is putting aside or the sacrifices your mother is making. Perhaps a beloved piece of family land will be sold, or a prized loom will be included. You might feel a strange mixture of pride and guilt, pride that your family values you enough to make such an investment, but guilt over the burden you represent. You are both the recipient of a grand gesture and the cause of a significant financial drain. It's a bit like being a star athlete whose success relies entirely on your parents' enormous financial sacrifice for your training. The dowry also served as a kind of insurance policy. If your husband died, or if the marriage was annulled, though that was incredibly rare, a portion of the dowry might be returned to your family, or it might provide for your maintenance as a widow. It wasn't perfect protection, but it offered a semblance of security in an insecure world. Without it, you are incredibly vulnerable. Imagine facing the world with no safety net, no financial backing. That was the fate of a dowerless girl. Your worth, in a very practical sense, was often measured by what you brought to the table, both literally and figuratively. With the dowry negotiated and agreed upon, the next step in your predetermined path is the betrothal, a ceremony often conducted years before the actual wedding day. This isn't just a casual promise. It's a mainstream historical fact that the betrothal was a legally binding contract, solidifying the future union and often involving formal oaths and public witnesses. For you, the child bride, it's the moment your fate is truly sealed, a heavy chain that links your young life to a stranger. Imagine a world where engagements weren't a romantic question popped on one knee, but a solemn, almost clinical agreement between two families, often made when the engaged couple was still playing with dolls. The betrothal could happen when you were incredibly young, sometimes barely out of toddlerhood, as canon law permitted contracts from the age of 7. This pre-contractual stage was a quirky or fringe tidbit of medieval legal custom. While not a full marriage, it carried significant weight. Breaking a betrothal was a serious matter, often incurring financial penalties and social disgrace, affecting not just the individuals but their entire families. It was like signing a mortgage for a house you wouldn't move into for a decade, knowing that backing out would ruin your credit and your reputation. Historians still argue whether these early betrothals contributed to a sense of predestined resignation among girls, or if some secretly harbored hopes of the contract falling through, however slim the chance. You might be dressed in your finest clothes, perhaps a simple gown if your family is of modest means, or richly embroidered silk if you belong to the elite. You'd stand before witnesses, your parents, the parents of your future husband, perhaps a local priest or a legal representative. Words would be exchanged, vows made, and sometimes a token given, a ring, a piece of jewelry, or even a symbolic hand clasp. This wasn't about love. It was about agreement. It was about property, lineage, and the binding of two families into a new, stronger whole. You might feel a knot in your stomach, a vague sense of unease, as you dimly perceive the gravity of the occasion without fully understanding its implications for your personal freedom. Consider little Isabella of Valois, who became engaged to Richard II of England when she was just 6 years old. She famously brought her dolls with her when she eventually moved to England. While this was a high-profile dynastic example, it perfectly illustrates the reality of children being bound by adult decisions. You, too, are a pawn in a larger game. Your childhood innocence contrasted sharply with the weighty political and economic maneuverings happening around you. It's a bit like being told you're going to be an astronaut when you're 5, but instead of space, it's a lifetime commitment to a stranger. The betrothal wasn't just a promise. It was often a strategic move to secure an alliance quickly, especially in volatile times. If a family faced a threat or saw an opportunity, a quick betrothal could solidify support. It also meant that your future was mapped out, reducing uncertainty. For your parents, for you, however, it eliminated any possibility of personal choice, any notion of finding a partner based on mutual affection or compatibility. Your path was set, often before you could even articulate what a future truly meant. You were committed, even if your only commitment was to the doll clutched in your small hand. With the betrothal sealed, your fate is no longer your own, if it ever truly was. Soon, perhaps mere months after your 12th birthday, the day arrives when you must leave behind everything familiar. This is not a fun family trip or a holiday adventure, it's a momentous and often terrifying displacement. The mainstream historical fact is that it was common for young brides, especially those from noble or wealthy families, to leave their birth homes and journey to live with their new husbands, family, often in distant lands or unfamiliar regions. Imagine packing a small wooden chest, not with clothes for a brief visit, but with every possession you own, knowing that you might never see your childhood home or your blood relatives again. You say your tearful goodbyes, clinging to your mother, perhaps even a favorite nurse or servant who has been with you since infancy. The faces around you are a mix of solemnity and forced cheer, trying to reassure you, but their own anxieties are palpable. Your father, stoic and resolute, offers words of advice about duty and obedience. Then you embark. The journey itself can be arduous. If you're from a peasant family, it might be a short walk to a neighboring village. But if you're a noble child, your journey could span weeks or even months, traversing treacherous roads, crossing rivers, and navigating through dense forests. You might travel by cart, a bumpy, uncomfortable ride, or perhaps on horseback. Your small frame jostled for hours on end. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that these journeys were incredibly dangerous. Beyond the usual risks of bad roads or bad weather, there was always the threat of bandits, disease, or even rival factions attempting to intercept a valuable bride for political leverage. Imagine being a child, barely understanding the world, and knowing that every rustle in the trees or every stranger on the road could spell disaster. Historians still argue whether the emotional trauma of such a sudden and absolute separation was ever truly acknowledged by medieval parents, or if it was simply accepted as an unavoidable rite of passage. Did they grieve the parting as much as you, or was the strategic benefit of the marriage enough to outweigh the personal cost? The landscape changes around you. Familiar fields give way to unfamiliar forests. Local dialects morph into strange accents. You might not speak the language of your new home fluently, if at all, especially if your marriage is a cross-border alliance. This linguistic barrier further amplifies your sense of isolation. You are a stranger in a strange land, surrounded by new faces, new customs, and a looming sense of the unknown. It's like being dropped into the middle of a foreign country with only a phrasebook and a prayer, knowing that this isn't a vacation, it's your new life. You might clutch a small doll, a cherished trinket from your childhood, a tangible link to the life you're leaving behind. Each mile further from home feels like another strand of connection snapping. The comforts of your nursery, the familiar faces of your childhood companions, the particular smell of your mother's cooking, all recede into a rapidly fading memory. You are entering a new reality where you must adapt quickly, suppress your fears, and learn to navigate an entirely new social landscape, all while your heart aches for what you've lost. Having survived the arduous journey and the painful separation from your family, you now arrive at your new home, your husband's household. This isn't the cozy, familiar warmth of your childhood abode. It's a new environment, often imposing and formal, and your reception might be polite but rarely loving. The mainstream historical fact is that your integration into your new home often meant living under the direct authority of your mother-in-law, who held significant power over the domestic sphere and often dictated the new bride's daily life. Imagine moving in with your partner's parents, only they're not just their parents. They're the absolute rulers of the house, and your entire existence is now subject to their whims and expectations. Your mother-in-law is not just a figurehead. She is the manager of the household, from the bustling kitchens to the sprawling estates, if it's a noble family. She oversees the servants, directs the daily chores, and maintains the family's reputation. And now, you, the young bride, are under her watchful eye. Her role is to train you, to mold you into a suitable wife for her son, and to ensure you uphold the family's standards. This can be a harsh apprenticeship. She might critique your manners, your needlework, your understanding of household accounts. Every perceived failing is a mark against you, a sign that you are not yet worthy of her son or her family name. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some households, the mother-in-law might even inspect your personal belongings, checking for anything she deemed inappropriate or a bad influence. It was like a medieval TSA search for your soul, ensuring no subversive thought or trinket had made it past the family gates. Historians still argue whether the relationship between a young bride and her mother-in-law was more often characterized by rivalry and tension, or if genuine bonds of mentorship and affection could form over time. The lack of detailed personal accounts makes it difficult to definitively gauge the prevalence of either dynamic. You spend your days learning the rhythms of this new household. The servants, initially wary, slowly begin to see you as part of the establishment, but true friendships are hard to forge when you are simultaneously the lady of the house or soon to be and a perpetual student. Your husband, perhaps much older than you, is likely preoccupied with his own duties, managing lands, engaging in warfare, or pursuing trade. He might be a distant figure, a formal presence whose primary interaction with you involves instruction or, eventually, the expectation of heirs. There's a subtle humor in realizing your romantic partner is more like a strict landlord than a soulmate. The pressure to conform is immense. You are expected to quickly grasp the local customs, the family traditions, and the unspoken rules that govern every interaction. A wrong step, a misspoken word, could bring shame upon your new family, and, by extension, upon your own. You learn to observe, to listen, to anticipate. Your personal preferences, your former habits, even your childhood dreams, must be suppressed in favor of seamless integration. This isn't a leisurely adjustment. It's a rapid transformation dictated by survival and social expectations. You are a new plant, transplanted into unfamiliar soil, expected to immediately take root and blossom, regardless of the conditions. As you settle into the demanding rhythms of your new home, an even more daunting aspect of your marriage looms: the expectation of intimacy. For a child bride, often married just as her body begins to change, this was a profound and frequently traumatic experience. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval girls received virtually no education or preparation regarding conjugal duties or sexual relations before marriage. You were expected to understand, to accept, and to perform, all without prior knowledge or guidance. Imagine being handed a complex instruction manual for a machine you've never seen, in a language you barely understand, and being told, "Figure it out." Your parents, bound by social custom and modesty, would never have discussed such matters. With you, it was considered inappropriate, perhaps even sinful, to speak openly about sex, especially with an unmarried girl. Any knowledge you might glean would be from hushed whispers among older women, vague warnings, or perhaps the crude jokes of servants, none of which would offer true understanding or comfort. You are plunged into an entirely new dimension of human experience, one that is physically intimate, emotionally complex, and entirely unknown. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval medical texts, usually written by men, discussed remedies for female reluctance or frigidity, hinting at the widespread difficulty many women faced adapting to the marital bed. These cures often involved herbs or potions, rather than any recognition of the emotional or psychological distress of the bride. Historians still argue whether the Church's emphasis on procreation as the primary purpose of sex, combined with the lack of sexual education, contributed to a widespread disconnect between women and their own bodies and desires. Was it simply a duty to be performed, or could genuine intimacy ever blossom under such constrained circumstances? The wedding night itself would be a terrifying ordeal for many. Medieval marriage rituals sometimes included a public bedding ceremony, where the couple was escorted to their bedchamber by family and friends, further amplifying the pressure and anxiety. You would be expected to submit, to be compliant, and to fulfill your marital obligation. There's a grim irony in the situation. You're an asset, a piece of property, and yet you're also expected to perform a very private, personal act. On demand, it's like being a stage actor forced into a dramatic role without any rehearsal or even a script. The vulnerability is profound. Your body, still developing, is now subject to the will of an older, often unknown, man. There is no concept of consent as you understand it today. Your consent was given by your parents, by the betrothal contract, by the societal expectation. Any discomfort, pain, or fear would likely be dismissed as girlish nerves, rather than a legitimate response. You are learning, in the most visceral way possible, the profound imbalance of power inherent in your marriage. It's a harsh lesson, and one that many child brides carried with them for the rest of their lives. Having navigated the profound and often traumatic initiation into marital intimacy, another, even more significant, challenge quickly emerges: the specter of early pregnancy. For a girl whose body is still developing, whose bones are not yet fully formed, and whose emotional maturity is lagging far behind her new responsibilities, this is not a joyous anticipation, but a terrifying prospect. The mainstream historical fact is that early pregnancy carried immense risks for both the young mother and her baby, leading to high rates of mortality and long-term health complications. Your youthful body, barely out of childhood, is now tasked with the monumental burden of gestation and childbirth. Imagine the fear that grips you each month as you await a sign, or the crushing dread when that sign fails to appear. You might hear whispers from older women about the pains of labor, the dangers of childbed fever, or the heartbreaking frequency of stillbirths. These aren't abstract concepts. They are the lived realities of women around you. You've likely witnessed it yourself, a neighbor, a relative, perhaps even a servant, struggling through a difficult birth or mourning the loss of an infant. For you, this is not just a statistical risk. It's a very personal, imminent threat. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval medical texts, albeit rudimentary, advised against early marriage for girls, specifically citing the dangers of pregnancy to an underdeveloped body. However, these medical concerns were often overridden by political, economic, and social pressures to secure alliances and heirs quickly. It's a bit like knowing a bridge is unsafe, but having to cross it anyway, because there's no other route. Historians still argue whether the physical toll of early and frequent pregnancies contributed significantly to the lower life expectancy of medieval women compared to men, especially within the reproductive years. Was their biological purpose their ultimate undoing? The pressure to conceive is often immense, especially if your husband's family is anxious for an heir. This pressure comes not just from your husband, but from your mother-in-law, your own parents, and the wider community. Your value as a wife is intrinsically tied to your fertility. If you fail to conceive, or if you only bear daughters, the anxiety mounts. You are not just a person. You are a vessel for the next generation, and your success is measured by the fruit of your womb. There's a grim joke in there somewhere. You're expected to be a fully functioning adult, and also a human incubator, all before you've even figured out how to properly curtsy. The physical demands are relentless. Pregnancy means continued labor, often without much respite, and certainly without the modern luxuries of prenatal care or even adequate nutrition. You continue with your daily duties, from drawing water to preparing meals, even as your body undergoes profound changes. The delivery itself would take place in rudimentary conditions, often at home, with limited medical knowledge or intervention. The pain is unimaginable, the risk ever present, and should you survive, the cycle would likely begin again, quickly. For the medieval mindset prioritized numerous births to offset the high infant mortality rates. Your body, still recovering, would be prepared for the next imposition, the next chance to secure your family's future. The immense dangers of early pregnancy lead us directly to the grim, ever-present reality that shadowed every medieval life, especially that of a child bride, the pervasive threat of death. The mainstream historical fact is that mortality rates for both mothers and infants were astonishingly high in the Middle Ages, with many women succumbing during or shortly after childbirth, and a significant percentage of children not surviving beyond their first year. You are living in a world where death is not a distant concept, but a familiar visitor, a constant reminder of life's fragility. Imagine the sheer psychological burden of knowing that each pregnancy could be your last, and each birth could mean burying your child. You've likely witnessed countless such tragedies. Perhaps a neighbor who brightened with hope during her pregnancy suddenly becomes a figure of sorrow, her face etched with grief for a baby who never drew a breath or who faded away within days. You've seen the shrouds, heard the mournful bells, and perhaps even helped prepare a tiny body for burial. This isn't just news from a distant land. It's the stark reality of your daily existence, a part of the air you breathe. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval gravestones or effigies for women specifically included carvings of swaddled infants, even if those infants were stillborn or died shortly after birth, symbolizing the mother's primary role and often her ultimate sacrifice. It was a poignant, albeit morbid, recognition of the perils of procreation. Historians still argue whether the high infant and maternal mortality rates desensitized medieval society to death, or if the frequent losses simply meant that grief was an even more constant companion for families. Did they simply accept it as God's will, or did they endure profound, unspoken sorrow with each loss? For you, the young bride, this pervasive mortality amplifies the pressure to produce many children. If one child dies, you must try for another. If two die, you try for a third. It's a relentless, emotionally draining cycle of hope, fear, and often profound loss. Your body is pushed to its limits, constantly recovering from one birth only, to prepare for the next, all while your heart carries the unseen scars of potential or actual bereavement. There's a dark humor here. Your uterus is essentially on a production line, and any faulty units simply mean you have to work harder. The absence of modern medicine, sanitation, and nutritional understanding meant that even minor complications could become fatal. Childbed fever, infections, prolonged labor. These were not rare occurrences, but common threats. And for the infants, diseases that are easily treatable today were deadly scourges. Diarrhea, respiratory infections, malnutrition. All could claim a tiny life within days or weeks. You are living in a world where the odds are stacked against both you and your offspring from the very beginning. Your life is defined not just by the prospect of marriage, but by the ever-present shadow of the grave, a shadow that seems particularly long and dark when cast over the smallest, most vulnerable members of society. Given the terrifying mortality rates, the next crucial duty thrust upon your young shoulders is the absolute necessity of producing a male heir. This isn't just a preference. It's a non-negotiable imperative that dictates your entire value. Within your new family, the mainstream historical fact is that the primary purpose of aristocratic and wealthy marriages was often the production of a male heir to continue the family lineage, secure land ownership, and ensure political stability. You are not merely a wife. You are a genetic bridge, a living conduit for the family name to pass into the next generation. Imagine the suffocating pressure. Every time you conceive, there's an unspoken expectation, a silent prayer echoing through the household. Let it be a boy, let it be a son. If your firstborn is a daughter, there might be polite congratulations, but also a lingering disappointment, a quiet insistence that you must try again, and quickly. If you have several daughters in a row, the pressure becomes almost unbearable. Your worth, your success, your very purpose in this family hinges on your ability to produce a male child. It's like being in a relentless sporting competition where only gold medals count, and anything less means you've failed. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval theories about conception sometimes blamed the woman for producing daughters, suggesting her seed was somehow weaker or less dominant than the man's. This unscientific belief further amplified the burden on women to deliver sons, despite genetics being entirely out of their control. Historians still argue whether the intense focus on male heirs inadvertently granted women a form of power, albeit a fragile one, as their fertility became the ultimate determinant of a family's future success and continuity. Was the womb truly the seat of power, even if it meant immense personal sacrifice? The fear of not producing a male heir is profound. If you fail, your husband's family might look for reasons to annul the marriage, to send you back to your parents in disgrace, or even to replace you with a more fertile or son-producing bride. For your husband, the lack of a male heir means his legacy is threatened, his lands might pass to a distant relative, and his family's influence could wane. You are caught in the crosshairs of dynastic anxiety, and your biological function is paramount. There's a dark sort of comedy in the situation. You're a child, barely understanding what a legacy is, but you're directly responsible for one. This intense focus means your pregnancies are not just personal events. They are public spectacles, watched with bated breath by everyone connected to the family. Prayers are said, charms are worn, and perhaps even pilgrimages are undertaken, all to ensure the safe delivery of a son. Your body is no longer your own. It is a battleground in the fight for lineage and power. You are not just carrying a baby, you are carrying the hopes, fears, and future of an entire family, and perhaps even a dynasty. As you navigate the relentless pressures of your new life, particularly the overwhelming demand for a male heir, you quickly discover a pervasive sense of emotional isolation. You are surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. The mainstream historical fact is that young brides, especially those married into distant or foreign households, often experienced significant emotional isolation, cultural shock, and a profound sense of loneliness in their new environments. Imagine arriving in a new country today, not knowing the language, the customs, or a single friendly face, and then being expected to manage a household and produce children. That's your daily reality, the familiar faces of your childhood yore. Mother, siblings, trusted servants, and childhood friends, now a world away. Letters are rare and slow to travel, if they happen at all. You are physically present in your husband's home, but emotionally you feel adrift. The customs, the food, even the cadence of speech might be different. You might find yourself constantly trying to decipher unspoken rules, struggling to understand nuanced social cues, and always feeling slightly out of place. It's like being perpetually in a foreign land, a tourist who can never go home. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some noble women would secretly keep small mementos from their childhood home, perhaps a dried flower or a scrap of fabric, hidden away as a tangible link to their past, a small rebellion against their emotional displacement. Historians still argue whether the apparent stoicism of medieval women in adapting to these new lives was a genuine lack of emotional response, or a carefully constructed facade necessary for survival in a world that offered little space for vulnerability. Did they truly become hardened, or did they simply learn to bury their sorrows deep within? Your husband, if he's much older, might see you more as a ward or an asset than an emotional companion. His primary interests might lie in the fields, the battlefield, or the marketplace, far removed from the domestic sphere. His mother, your formidable mother-in-law, is likely focused on training you, not comforting you. The servants, while perhaps initially curious, will eventually treat you with the deference due to your status, but rarely with genuine warmth or camaraderie. You are the new lady, and that title often comes with a chilling distance. There's a quiet tragedy in this. You're surrounded by life, yet feel like an island. You yearn for understanding, for a familiar laugh, for someone who knows the stories of your youth. But those connections are severed. You learn to internalize your feelings, to present a composed exterior, because any sign of weakness or homesickness might be seen as a failure to adapt, a stain on your family's honor. This emotional isolation can be profound, shaping your personality, forcing you to develop an inner resilience, or perhaps simply to retreat into yourself. You are living a life that demands performance, not genuine connection, and you must find a way to survive within its solitary confines. Given the heavy emphasis on domestic duties and the urgent need for heirs, it comes as no surprise that your formal education, as you understand it today, was largely non-existent. The mainstream historical fact is that formal education, particularly literacy and academic subjects, was generally not provided to medieval girls, with learning primarily focused on practical household management and religious instruction. Forget classrooms with eager students and chalkboards. Your education was hands-on, relentless, and directly tied to your future role as a wife and mistress of a household. Imagine a world where reading and writing were specialized skills, often reserved for scribes, clergy, or men involved in trade and law. For you, a medieval girl, your lessons wouldn't involve Latin grammar or philosophical debates. Instead, you'd learn by doing. You'd be taught to manage servants, to oversee the preparation of food, to mend clothing, to spin wool, to brew ale, and perhaps to care for livestock. Your mother, or your mother-in-law, would be your primary teacher. Her instruction delivered through example and direct correction, often without much patience for mistakes. It's like an endless, high-stakes internship where your performance dictates your entire future. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that while most girls didn't learn to read, some noblewomen might have been taught to recognize household accounts and inventories, allowing them to manage estates in their husband's absence. This was a practical skill, not an academic pursuit, but it provided a glimpse into a world beyond purely domestic duties. Historians still argue whether the lack of formal education for girls was a deliberate method of control, keeping women subservient, or simply a reflection of societal priorities, where practical skills for domestic and reproductive roles were deemed paramount. Was knowledge a weapon withheld, or simply considered irrelevant to their destined path? Your days are filled with tangible tasks. You learn the rhythm of the seasons, the nuances of preserving food, the intricacies of managing a complex household that might include dozens of people. You learn to identify herbs for medicine, to supervise the baking of bread, to organize the distribution of provisions. These are not trivial skills. They are vital for the survival and prosperity of your new family. You are a functional cog in a larger machine, and your education is tailored precisely to that function. There's a certain grim humor in it. You're not learning to write poetry. You're learning to ensure everyone gets fed and clothed, which, arguably, is far more practical in a pre-industrial society. While religious instruction was common, often focused on piety, obedience, and the virtues of a good Christian wife, even this rarely extended to widespread literacy in sacred texts. You might learn prayers by rote, hear sermons in church, and be taught the stories of saints. But deciphering the Bible for yourself would be an exceptional privilege, largely confined to women in religious orders. Your world, in terms of intellectual pursuits, is small and circumscribed, designed to equip you for your immediate responsibilities, not for independent thought or scholarly exploration. Despite the lack of formal academic education, your life as a medieval child bride quickly transforms into a rigorous masterclass in household management. This isn't just about tidying up. It's a demanding, multifaceted role that often determines the very survival and prosperity of your new family. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval wives, particularly those in noble or wealthy households, were responsible for the complex and extensive management of the household, which functioned as the economic and social heart of the family unit. You are, essentially, the chief operating officer of a small, self-sufficient enterprise, often with little prior training. Imagine waking before dawn, the chill of the morning air biting at your skin. Your day isn't spent pondering philosophical questions, but on the practicalities of everyday life. You oversee the kitchen staff, ensuring meals are prepared and provisions are accounted for. You manage the larder, keeping track of dwindling supplies of grain, salted meat, and dried fruits. You direct the laundresses, the seamstresses, the dairymaids. You are responsible for the health and well-being of not just your immediate family, but often all the servants and retainers who live within your walls. It's a bit like running a small, bustling village where everyone looks to you for direction. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some larger households, the mistress would keep detailed account books, meticulously recording every expenditure and income, often using a system of tally sticks or rudimentary numbers, even if she wasn't fully literate in reading prose. These household books offer rare glimpses into the daily economic lives of medieval women. Historians still argue whether the extensive domestic responsibilities granted women a significant, albeit informal, form of power within their households, or if these duties were simply an additional burden that further constrained their lives. Within the private sphere, was managing the pantry a path to influence, or just another chore? You learn to diagnose minor illnesses and administer folk remedies, tending to sick servants or ailing children with a mix of practical knowledge and fervent prayer. You manage the production of cloth, from raw wool to spun thread to woven fabric. You might supervise brewing ale, baking bread, or making cheese. These are not tasks you delegate entirely. You are expected to understand each process, to spot inefficiencies, and to ensure quality. There's a certain satisfaction in seeing a well-run household, in knowing that your efforts directly contribute to everyone's comfort and sustenance. But it's also a relentless grind, with little time for rest or personal pursuits. This constant labor is your reality. Even when pregnant, you are expected to continue your duties, adapting them as your body allows, but rarely relinquishing them entirely. Your ability to maintain a smooth, efficient household directly reflects on your husband's status and reputation. A well-run household speaks volumes about the competence of its mistress, and by extension, the prosperity of its master. You are the invisible engine, the quiet force that keeps the entire machinery of your new family functioning. And you learn fast, because the consequences of failure, hunger, illness, or shammer, immediate and severe. Beyond the immediate confines of the household, your role as a medieval wife often extended into the broader economic landscape, contributing far more than simply managing domestic affairs. This crucial aspect of women's lives is often overlooked. The mainstream historical fact is that many medieval women, especially those in mercantile or artisanal families, made significant, though often unacknowledged and unpaid, economic contributions to their family businesses and the wider economy. You were not merely a homemaker. You were often an integral part of the family's livelihood, a silent partner in their ventures. Imagine your husband is a merchant, traveling for weeks or months at a time to distant markets. Who is managing the workshop, handling the accounts, or dealing with suppliers and customers while he's away? That would be you. You'd know the intricate details of the family trade, from the quality of the wool to the price of spices. You might negotiate deals, collect debts, and oversee production, ensuring the business continues to thrive in your husband's absence. It's like being the acting CEO of a small company, but without the official title or the direct salary. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some guild structures, women were explicitly allowed to take over their deceased husband's business and even inherit his guild membership, provided they could demonstrate proficiency in the trade. This highlights a pragmatic recognition of their existing skills and contributions, even if they were usually overshadowed by their male counterparts. Historians still argue whether these active economic roles granted women more independence and influence than previously thought, or if their contributions were simply seen as an extension of their wifely duties, never truly challenging the patriarchal power structures. Was it empowerment through necessity, or just another set of tasks? Your hands are likely skilled in multiple areas. If your family runs a tavern, you might be brewing the ale and serving customers. If they are weavers, you are probably involved in every step of the cloth production. Your economic efforts directly contribute to the family's income, putting food on the table and keeping the roof over your head. You might not receive a personal wage, but your labor is undeniably valuable, often indispensable. There's a subtle irony here. You have immense practical power over the family's finances and operations. Yet legally, you're often considered your husband's property. This deep involvement in the family business meant that knowledge and skills were passed down through generations, not just from father to son, but often from mother to daughter. You learn the trade from watching and assisting, gaining an intimate understanding of its nuances. Your reliability and competence allow your husband to travel for extended periods, confident that his enterprise is in safe and capable hands. You are working in common, as you've heard before, raising the family up, ensuring its prosperity for the benefit of your children. You are not just raising children, you are raising an entire economic entity, one thread at a time. The relentless demands of household management and economic contribution bring us to a critical turning point in a medieval woman's life: widowhood. This transition was a complex blend of potential freedom and profound vulnerability, often dictated by your social status and the circumstances of your late husband's estate. The mainstream historical fact is that while widowhood could grant women a degree of legal and economic independence often denied to them during marriage, it also presented significant challenges, including the loss of protection and potential economic precarity. Imagine being granted a kind of emancipation, but simultaneously losing your primary source of security in a deeply patriarchal society. For some, especially wealthy noblewomen with substantial dowries or jointure property set aside for the wife's use after her husband's death, widowhood could offer unprecedented autonomy. You might gain control over vast estates, manage your own finances, and even make political decisions that would have been unthinkable as a wife. You could choose not to remarry or to marry someone of your own choosing, a luxury almost unheard of for a young bride. You might even find yourself courted for your wealth and influence, rather than just your youth or beauty. It's like graduating from being a chess piece to finally getting to move your own pawns. However, for the vast majority of women, particularly those from poorer or less privileged backgrounds, widowhood was often a perilous state. Without a husband, you lost your legal protector, your advocate in a world where women's rights were severely limited. You might face economic hardship, especially if your husband's estate was small or heavily indebted. You might be forced to rely on charity or to seek employment in a society that offered few respectable options for single women. There was always the pressure to remarry, especially if you were still young and fertile, as a widow without male. Protection was seen as vulnerable to exploitation or even social disorder. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some wills included provisions where a widow's inheritance was conditional on her remaining unmarried or on her choice of a new husband, reflecting the continuing desire of the deceased husband's family to maintain control over his assets and lineage. Historians still argue whether the perceived freedom of widowhood was genuinely empowering for a significant number of women, or if it merely highlighted the fragility of female existence outside the confines of male guardianship. Was it liberation, or just a different kind of confinement? You might mourn your husband, even if your marriage was one of convenience, for he was your anchor in a turbulent world. His death throws you into a new, often terrifying, uncertainty. You are no longer defined by your husband's name, but by his absence. Your future, once tied to his, is now a blank slate, filled with both daunting responsibility and the faint glimmer of personal choice. It's like being unexpectedly given the keys to a grand, but slightly dilapidated, mansion you now own. But you also have to figure out how to keep it from falling apart. Even as a child bride, navigating the complex dynamics of your new family and the uncertainties of widowhood, there was one undeniable path to securing your position and even wielding influence through your children. The mainstream historical fact is that a medieval woman's status and influence within her husband's family, and indeed within society, significantly increased upon the birth of children, especially sons. You might have arrived as a mere girl, an appendage to an alliance, but the moment you produced an heir, your importance soared. Imagine the collective sigh of relief, the celebratory feasting, and the subtle shift in how you were treated once a healthy son is born. Before, you were the vessel for ambition. Now, you are the proven mother of the next generation. Your mother-in-law, once your stern instructor, might show a new respect, recognizing your crucial contribution to the family's continuity. Your husband, previously a distant figure, might now see you as the indispensable partner in his legacy. You are no longer just a bride. You are the source of the family's future, the anchor of its lineage. It's like being a new employee who suddenly lands the biggest client, instantly earning a seat at the executive table. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some noble families, the birth of a male heir would be announced with public celebrations, bonfires, and even special prayers of thanksgiving, often more elaborate than the wedding itself, underscoring the child's immense dynastic importance. Historians still argue whether this elevation in status, dependent solely on reproductive success, genuinely empowered women or merely solidified their role as biological instruments for male lineage. Did the birth of a son grant true agency, or just a more comfortable form of servitude? The presence of children, particularly sons, provided you with a tangible, undeniable purpose within your husband's household. They were your leverage, your security, and your connection to the future. If your husband were to die, your position, as the mother of his children, especially his male heir, would grant you rights and protections that a childless widow might not receive. You might become a regent for your young son, wielding significant power until he came of age, effectively ruling in his name. Remember Margaret Beaufort, Henry VII's mother, who, after giving birth at 13, became a powerful and influential figure, securing her son's claim to the throne. Her son was her power, even if you didn't achieve a regency. Your children provided emotional solace in an often lonely existence. They were your own, born of your body, and a source of deep affection in a marriage that may have lacked it. They were a part of you in a world where so much of your life was dictated by others. This bond, forged in the intimate shared experience of motherhood, offered a unique sense of belonging and purpose. You are not just raising babies, you are cultivating your own future, ensuring your own place in a world that often saw you as merely temporary. Despite the formidable societal pressures and the often unquestioned acceptance of arranged child marriages, there were, albeit rare, instances of resistance and even outright rebellion against unwanted unions. This offers a glimpse into the human spirit's enduring desire for self-determination. The mainstream historical fact is that while uncommon and fraught with severe consequences, some medieval girls and women attempted to resist or escape arranged marriages. Though such efforts often led to social ostracism, legal repercussions, or forced compliance. You might imagine a secret elopement, a dramatic refusal at the altar, or a desperate plea to a sympathetic authority figure. Imagine the immense courage it would take to defy your parents, your community, and the very fabric of society. Your options were incredibly limited. You might try to appeal to a sympathetic bishop, arguing that your betrothal was made under duress, or before you reached the age of true consent. You might run away, seeking refuge in a convent, though even there you could be forcibly retrieved. Some might feign illness, or even attempt self-mutilation in a desperate bid to render themselves undesirable. It's like trying to escape a highly secure prison using only a spoon and a whispered wish. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some extremely rare cases, a girl might claim a pre-contract with another man, even if fabricated, knowing that bigamy was forbidden by the church and could invalidate the unwanted marriage. This risky maneuver, if believed, could free her from one bond, but often landed her in another form of trouble. Historians still argue whether such acts of resistance were truly driven by personal desire for freedom, or if they were often orchestrated by rival families seeking to disrupt a political alliance. Was it a rebellion of the heart, or just another strategic chess move? The consequences of resistance were severe. If you were from a noble family, a refusal could plunge your family into disgrace, jeopardizing their alliances and potentially costing them land or influence. For a commoner, it might mean complete disinheritance, being cast out to face poverty and shame. The Church, while offering annulment in specific circumstances like consanguinity, meaning too closely related, rarely sided with a girl simply because she disliked her intended. Disobedience was a sin, and marriage was a sacrament. There's a grim humor in the idea that your only true out might involve proving you were somehow related to your husband, which, in a world of limited genealogical records, was a long shot. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, these acts of defiance occurred. They are faint echoes in the historical record, often buried in legal documents or ecclesiastical court proceedings, but they speak volumes about the human longing for agency. These girls and women, against all odds, dared to dream of a different life, to resist the preordained path. You feel a pang of admiration for their bravery, even as you understand the immense personal cost they likely paid for their momentary rebellion. Their stories, though fragmented, remind us that even within the darkest constraints, the human spirit can flicker with resistance. Building on the rare glimpses of resistance, it's important to understand the medieval legal mechanism that offered a theoretical escape route from an unwanted marriage: annulment. However, this was far from a simple divorce, and certainly not a readily available option for a distraught child bride. The mainstream historical fact is that annulment in the Middle Ages was a declaration that a marriage had never been valid in the first place, rather than a dissolution of an existing union, and it was granted only under very specific and limited circumstances by the Church. You couldn't just decide you weren't happy. You had to prove the marriage was fundamentally flawed from its inception. Imagine trying to argue your case before a stern ecclesiastical court, perhaps staffed by men who believed marriage was a divine sacrament to be preserved at all costs. The grounds for annulment were highly restrictive. The most common reasons involved consanguinity, the parties being too closely related by blood, sometimes to degrees that seem incredibly distant by modern standards. Affinity related by previous marriage, like marrying your deceased spouses. Cousin, pre-contract one party, already being legally bound to someone else. Or lack of true consent, though this was incredibly difficult to prove for children, often requiring evidence of force or coercion. There was also the very sensitive issue of non-consummation, but proving a lack of consummation often involved highly intrusive examinations and was a deeply humiliating process. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the rules around consanguinity were so complex and could be traced back so many generations that it was sometimes possible to find some distant familial link between almost any two noble families, making it a convenient, albeit often fabricated, excuse for annulment when a political alliance soured. Historians still argue whether the strict annulment laws, despite their narrow scope, inadvertently provided powerful families with a loophole to escape inconvenient alliances when necessary, using pre-existing relationships as a legal pretext. Was the system truly about spiritual purity, or could it be manipulated for worldly gain? For you, the child bride trapped in an unwanted union, the prospect of annulment was a very slim hope, almost a myth. It would require your family's support, considerable financial resources to pursue the legal case, and compelling evidence that satisfied the church's strict criteria. Simply disliking your husband or finding the marriage unbearable was never a valid reason. The process itself could drag on for years, a public and humiliating ordeal that would leave you and your family exposed to gossip and scrutiny. There's a cruel irony here. Your only way out might be to prove you shouldn't have been in it in the first place. A technicality rather than a personal plea. Cases like that of Margaret Beaufort, whose first marriage was annulled due to consanguinity, highlight that annulment was possible for those with the right connections and circumstances. But for the vast majority of medieval girls and women, the marriage bond, once forged, was for life. The Church, while offering theoretical safeguards, primarily functioned as a reinforcing pillar of the existing social order, and that order prioritized stability and lineage over individual happiness. The challenging landscape of medieval marriage, with its rigid legalities and limited avenues for escape, leads us to confront the complex, often contradictory role of the Christian Church. While it provided the legal framework for marriage through canon law, it also imposed a specific moral and theological perspective that profoundly shaped women's lives, often reinforcing their subservience. The mainstream historical fact is that the medieval Church, while theoretically advocating for consent and condemning forced marriages, simultaneously promoted female obedience and submission to their husbands as a virtuous and divinely ordained duty. This created a powerful paradox for young brides. Imagine hearing sermons that extolled the virtues of Mary, the Virgin Mother, as the ideal woman, pure, obedient, and selfless. Then you'd hear passages from biblical texts, often interpreted by male clergy, that instructed wives to submit to their husbands in everything. You were taught that your suffering in childbirth was a penance for Eve's original sin, and that your path to salvation lay in piety, chastity, and humble acceptance of your lot. It's like being told you're free, but also that true freedom comes from always agreeing with your boss. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that while the Church was generally against forced marriages, some ecclesiastical courts might still compel a reluctant party to go through with a betrothal if it was deemed beneficial for the families involved, subtly prioritizing social order over individual will. This often meant a child's protestations were easily dismissed. Historians still argue whether the Church's dual message emphasizing both the sanctity of marriage and the wife's submission was a deliberate strategy to control female autonomy, or an honest reflection of patriarchal societal norms that simply permeated even religious thought. Was it spiritual guidance, or just social engineering cloaked in piety? For you, the child bride, these religious teachings deeply ingrained a sense of duty and resignation. To challenge your marriage, to defy your husband, was not just a social transgression. It was a sin against God. The fear of eternal damnation, or even earthly excommunication, was a powerful deterrent. You internalized the message that your personal desires were less important than your spiritual salvation, which was achieved through humble acceptance of your preordained role. There's a quiet cruelty in this. Your suffering is not just endured, it's framed as a path to holiness. Cases like that of Marjorie Kemp, a fascinating medieval mystic, speak volumes. As you may recall from other historical discussions, Marjorie desired to live a celibate, religious life, but her husband insisted on his conjugal rights, forcing her to continue bearing children against her will. This deeply personal struggle highlights the grim reality that women often had no rights over their own bodies after marriage, a concept reinforced by both legal and religious doctrine. The Church, while offering spiritual comfort, rarely intervened to protect a woman from her husband's marital demands, viewing them as his God-given right. You were instructed to endure, to suffer, and to find grace in your obedience, within the rigid framework of medieval marriage, where political and economic alliances reigned supreme. The idea of love as a foundational element was largely a foreign concept. The mainstream historical fact is that love and personal affection were rarely prerequisites for medieval marriages. Instead, they were considered a fortunate, but often unexpected, bonus that might or might not develop after the union was formalized. For you, the child bride, the notion of falling in love with your husband before marriage was as fanciful as a dragon flying overhead. Imagine a contract being drawn up, detailing lands, dowries, and future heirs, with absolutely no mention of mutual attraction or emotional compatibility. That's your reality. You might meet your future husband for the first time days before the wedding, or even on the wedding day itself. Your emotional connection is not a consideration. You are entering into a pragmatic arrangement designed to benefit to families, not to individuals. Any romantic inclinations you might harbor are childish fantasies that must be quickly extinguished for the sake of duty and decorum. It's like being forced into a business merger and then hoping you eventually learn to like your new business partner. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that while love marriages were rare, medieval courtly love literature, with its focus on idealized, often extramarital, romantic passion, may have provided an escape valve for emotional desires that could not be fulfilled within the confines of arranged marriage. These were fantasy narratives, distinct from the reality of daily life, but they hint at a yearning for affection. Historians still argue whether the concept of courtly love, despite its fantastical nature, subtly influenced real-world marital expectations over time, or if it remained purely a literary construct with little impact on the practicalities of medieval unions. Did the fictional romances ever bleed into reality? For you, if love did develop after marriage, it would be a pleasant surprise, a gentle warmth that might slowly grow from shared experiences, mutual respect, or the bond of raising children together. It was not something to be sought out beforehand, but something that might, with luck and patience, emerge from the practical partnership. Conversely, if no affection bloomed, you were still expected to fulfill your duties with diligence and obedience. Your personal feelings were secondary to the success of the alliance. There's a certain stoicism required, a quiet acceptance that personal happiness might not be a part of your marital equation. The idea of marrying for love is a relatively modern invention. In your medieval world, love was often seen as something dangerous, potentially disruptive to the carefully constructed social order. Passion could lead to impulsiveness, to defying family wishes, to making choices that were detrimental to the collective good. Therefore, marriages were too important to be left to the unpredictable whims of personal affection. You are entering a union built on strategy, not sentiment, and any emotional connection is merely a fortunate byproduct, if it happens at all. While the overwhelming narrative paints a picture of child brides as passive recipients of their fate, it's crucial to acknowledge that medieval women were not monolithic figures. Some, through sheer force of personality or exceptional circumstance, carved out lives that defied typical expectations. The mainstream historical fact is that despite the restrictive societal norms, Some medieval women, particularly those from powerful families or with strong individual wills, managed to exert influence, pursue personal interests, and occasionally challenge conventional roles. You might not have been one of them, but their stories offer a fascinating counterpoint to the common narrative of total female subjugation. Imagine women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, a powerhouse queen who divorced one king and married another, ruling vast territories and influencing European politics for decades. Or Isabella of France, the she-wolf of France, who orchestrated the overthrow of her own husband, Edward II. These are, of course, extreme examples from the very pinnacle of society, women whose lineage and wealth gave them a platform for action. They weren't ordinary child brides, but their existence proves that agency, however limited, could be found. It's like discovering that a few rare birds can fly higher than anyone ever thought possible. Even if most are still grounded, a quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval saints' lives, intended as moral exemplars, sometimes depicted women who defied forced marriages to pursue a religious vocation, illustrating that such resistance, while rare, was recognized even within pious narratives. Historians still argue whether the stories of these exceptional women represent genuine, albeit limited, female empowerment, or if they were merely anomalies whose influence served to reinforce the prevailing patriarchal system by demonstrating what could be achieved within its confines. Were they pioneers, or just powerful exceptions proving the rule? For you, the typical child bride, these grand narratives were likely distant echoes, if known at all. Your daily reality was far more circumscribed. However, even within more modest spheres, quiet acts of self-determination existed. Perhaps a wife who, through shrewd management of her household or business, garnered immense respect from her husband and community. Or a widow who, given her newfound autonomy, chose to invest her resources in her children's education or to support a local charity, exercising power in small, significant ways. There's a quiet heroism in these unsung acts of agency, a reminder that even without grand titles, life found ways to express individual will. These personalities remind us that while the dark truth of child marriage was widespread and often brutal, the medieval period was not entirely devoid of female agency. It's a complex tapestry, with threads of constraint interwoven with those of quiet resilience and, occasionally, outright defiance. You see that even within deeply entrenched systems, individuals could, and sometimes did, find ways to express their individuality and shape their own destinies, however subtly. As you contemplate these exceptional medieval women, you're faced with a frustrating reality. The vast majority of voices from the past, particularly those of children and ordinary women, remain agonizingly silent. We know so little about their inner lives, their hopes, their fears, beyond what can be inferred from legal documents or the writings of men. The mainstream historical fact is that personal testimony from medieval children and non-elite women is extremely rare, making it challenging for historians to reconstruct their subjective experiences and emotional lives. You hear echoes, but rarely direct, unfiltered voices. Imagine trying to understand the world based only on official reports, court records, and the memoirs of the powerful. That's largely what historians contend with when trying to understand your life. The medieval child bride, your experiences, your feelings of loneliness, fear, or even occasional joy were rarely deemed important enough to be recorded. You weren't writing diaries or sending lengthy letters to friends expressing your angst. Your stories, if they were told at all, were passed down orally, vulnerable to distortion or oblivion. It's like trying to understand a complex conversation when you only have access to one side of the phone call. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some of the most intimate glimpses into medieval women's lives come from unexpected sources, such as wills detailing the passing down of personal items like specific garments or small pieces of jewelry, or even illuminated manuscripts where women occasionally penned marginal notes or prayers in their own hand. These tiny, often overlooked details offer tantalizing hints of individual lives. Historians still argue whether the scarcity of female voices means their experiences were less diverse or rich than men's, or if it simply reflects a deliberate silencing by a patriarchal society that prioritized male narratives and accomplishments. Was the silence a void, or just an unrecorded symphony? For you, the child bride, your emotional world largely remained unspoken, hidden. You learned to keep your feelings private, to conform to expectations. Expressing distress or unhappiness could be seen as weakness, ingratitude, or even a challenge to authority. So, you adapted. You learned to perform the role assigned to you, to internalize your struggles. This doesn't mean you didn't feel them deeply. It simply means those feelings rarely made it into the historical record that survives today. There's a subtle sadness in this. Millions of lives lived, full of triumph and tragedy, yet largely lost to the sands of time. This lack of direct testimony forces us, as modern observers, to engage in an act of imaginative empathy to piece together fragments and infer emotions from circumstances. We must ask, if a modern teenage girl expresses despair at a forced marriage, wouldn't a medieval girl in a similar situation feel something profoundly similar? The absence of their explicit complaints doesn't negate the likelihood of their suffering. We are tasked with listening not just to what was written, but to the silence, and trying to hear the stories that were never meant to be told. The agonizing silence of medieval child brides compels us to look beyond the distant past and draw unsettling parallels with contemporary issues. The mainstream historical fact, vividly illustrated by your earlier description, is that the despair, lack of personal choice, and trauma experienced by modern child brides, such as those in Syria, mirror the likely emotional realities endured by their medieval counterparts, despite vast differences in societal context. You find yourself connecting the dots across centuries, seeing the same patterns of human suffering repeating, a haunting echo of lost childhoods. Imagine the Syrian teenage girl you read about, forced into marriage at 13, longing for school. Her life cut short by an arranged union. Now, overlay that image with the medieval child bride you've been imagining, just as young, just as bewildered, just as stripped of agency. The specific circumstances differ. One is fleeing war, the other born into a feudal system, but the core human experience of profound loss, betrayal, and helplessness feels chillingly similar. You realize that a human heart, regardless of the century it beats in, responds to profound injustice and deprivation with similar anguish. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some contemporary societies where child marriage persists, girls may attempt to resist by refusing to eat or by inflicting small, hidden injuries on themselves. Desperate acts that echo the limited forms of defiance some medieval girls might have attempted. Historians still argue whether acknowledging these strong emotional parallels risks imposing modern psychological frameworks onto past experiences. thereby distorting them, or if it is a necessary act of empathy to humanize historical figures, often treated as mere cogs in a system. Is it projection or simply shared humanity across time? You can almost hear the voices merging. The Syrian girl speaking of her revulsion at being forced into sexual relationships before her body or mind is ready, and the medieval girl enduring a similar, unconsented initiation into intimacy. Both fear pregnancy and domestic servitude, both long for lost childhoods. The anxieties surrounding Roman marriage, as we've discussed before, highlight how fundamental fears about a woman's future and her loss of autonomy upon marriage have been a constant thread throughout history. The specifics change, but the emotional core of the experience remains tragically consistent. There's a profound, almost spiritual ache in realizing that some pains are simply timeless. This isn't about perfectly equating to different eras. It's about recognizing the shared vulnerability of young girls caught in systems beyond their control. The medieval girl didn't know the term PTSD, but the trauma of war, displacement, and early marriage would have left indelible psychological scars, just as it does for the Syrian girls today. You are challenged to move beyond intellectual detachment and allow yourself to feel the weight of their combined experiences. To understand that human suffering, especially when inflicted upon the innocent, transcends historical context. The echoes of the past resonate powerfully when we turn our attention specifically to the struggles faced by modern child brides, particularly those impacted by conflict. The mainstream historical fact, drawing directly from the report you read yesterday, is that teenage girls in Syria, married between the ages of 13 and 16, often to much older men, frequently express despair over their lack of choice, their longing to return to school, and the profound feeling that their lives have been cut short. You hear their words, and you are immediately transported back to the silent anxieties of your medieval counterpart. Imagine the Syrian girl, traumatized by war, forced to flee her home, struggling with bereavement and poverty. Now, picture the medieval girl growing up amidst constant feudal warfare, raiding, famine, and the ever-present threat of plague. While the weapons and scale of conflict differ, the human experience of violence, displacement, and economic collapse is disturbingly similar. The fear, the uncertainty, the loss of security, these are universal responses to such brutal conditions, regardless of the century. You see that trauma, though perhaps not named or understood by medieval societies, was just as real and debilitating then as it is now. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that historical accounts, often in the form of chronicles or legal records, sometimes mention medieval children orphaned or displaced by war, highlighting the reality that conflict's youngest victims were a recurring feature of the landscape, though their personal stories rarely survived. Historians still argue whether the apparent stoicism or quick adaptation of medieval populations to hardship implies a different psychological makeup, or if it simply reflects a deeply ingrained cultural coping mechanism in the face of relentless adversity. Did they feel less, or just express it differently? The specific details of abuse mentioned by the Syrian girls, the hands of their husbands or mothers-in-law, forced sexual relationships before their bodies or minds are redefined. A chilling parallel in the potential realities of medieval child marriages. The concept of bodily autonomy was virtually non-existent for married women in the Middle Ages, and abuse, though rarely documented explicitly, was undoubtedly a grim reality for many. Just like the Roman wedding night, which you recalled as being filled with both hope and uncertainty for Roman women. The wedding night for a medieval girl was often a turning point marked by fear and a loss of control. There's a profound, uncomfortable truth here. The mechanisms of power and vulnerability can be strikingly similar across vast historical divides. These contemporary accounts force us to challenge the comfortable distance we sometimes place between ourselves and the past. When a Syrian girl speaks of longing for her lost childhood, her words cut across centuries and illuminate the probable feelings of a medieval child bride. We are no longer simply observing history. We are bearing witness to a continuous human narrative of resilience and suffering. Your heart aches not just for the girls of today, but for the countless unnamed girls of the past, whose tears and fears evaporated into the mists of time, unheard and unacknowledged. The vivid, heartbreaking testimonies of modern child brides, like those in Syria, force us to confront the undeniable continuity of psychological trauma. Regardless of the historical era, the mainstream historical fact is that while the medical understanding of conditions like PTSD did not exist in the Middle Ages, the profound psychological and emotional effects of war, displacement, poverty, and forced marriage would have undeniably impacted medieval children and adults alike. You're not just thinking about physical hardships. You're delving into the unseen scars on the soul. Imagine the medieval child who experienced famine, who saw their village burned, or who lost loved ones to plague or battle. Their minds and bodies would have reacted with terror, anxiety, and a deep sense of insecurity, just as a child today would. The constant threat of violence, the sudden uprooting from home, the loss of family members. These events don't just inflict physical damage. They leave indelible marks on one's psyche. It's easy to dismiss these impacts in the past, to say, that's just how things were, but you know better. Human neurology, at its core, processes fear and loss in fundamentally similar ways, whether you're cowering from a Cherokee in 1350 or an airstrike in 2025. Quirky or fringe tidbit is that medieval religious texts sometimes described individuals experiencing intense spiritual crises or profound melancholia, what we might now call depression, often attributing these states to demonic influence or divine punishment, but occasionally hinting at symptoms recognizable as responses to extreme stress or trauma. Historians still argue whether the apparent stoicism of medieval people in the face of widespread hardship was a true reflection of emotional resilience, or if it masked a pervasive, undiagnosed burden of psychological suffering. Did their faith truly inoculate them, or did it just provide a framework for enduring the unendurable? For you, the medieval child bride, the psychological burden of your early marriage compounded any pre-existing traumas. The loss of personal choice, the forced intimacy, the constant fear of childbirth, the pressure to produce heirs. These are all stresses that would accumulate, shaping your personality and your approach to life. You might develop coping mechanisms, a hardened exterior, a deep inner resilience, or perhaps a quiet despair. There's a particular kind of sad humor in it. You might not know what stress is, but your body and mind are constantly performing a masterclass in it. It's a powerful challenge to our modern tendency to compartmentalize history, to intellectualize past suffering rather than truly feel it. By acknowledging that medieval girls and women experienced confusion, fear, despair, and anger just as deeply as their modern counterparts, you break down the artificial barrier of time. The lack of their personal testimony does not negate their experience. It merely makes it our responsibility to imagine and bear witness to it. You realize that empathy is not confined to your own time, but is a bridge that can span centuries, connecting you directly to the human heart of the past. As we continue to bridge the chasm between historical eras and modern experiences, it's essential to recognize that even within the medieval period itself, the specific realities of child marriage varied significantly. Yet, underlying vulnerabilities and shared human responses often transcended these distinctions. The mainstream historical fact is that while the age of marriage, reasons for unions, and women's roles differed across medieval social classes and regions, underlying themes of limited female autonomy, the imperative for reproduction, and exposure to hardship were common experiences. You're seeing variations on a tragic theme. Imagine the conversation between a young daughter of the aristocracy, destined for a grand dynastic marriage, and a peasant girl living in the same era. One might lament being sent off at 12 to a foreign land, married to a stranger, far from her beloved mother, much like Joan of England, who tragically died of the Black Death at 14 on her way to her marriage. Her sorrow, though aristocratic, would be profound. The other, the peasant girl, might recall her terror of growing up in a village preyed upon by the local lord's men, the constant gnawing of hunger, the fear of the next famine, or the dangers of gathering firewood in the nearby wolf-infested wood. Both experienced intense fear and loss, but through different lenses. It's like comparing to different flavors of extremely bitter medicine. Both are awful, just in their own unique ways. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that in some peasant communities, marriages often occurred later than in the aristocracy, sometimes in the late teens or even early 20s, because younger girls were economically valuable laborers in their birth households, and poorer families needed time to accumulate even a modest dowry or resources for a new household. This practical delay often meant more physical maturity for childbirth, a small unintended benefit of poverty. Historians still argue whether the later marriage age for peasant women, despite its economic roots, provided them with a greater, albeit subtle, degree of personal agency in choosing a partner, or at least greater readiness for the challenges of marriage. Was necessity the mother of slightly delayed, and perhaps less brutal, unions? While the noble girl faced the pressures of dynastic alliances and the public scrutiny of her fertility, the peasant girl contended with brutal physical labor, the constant threat of famine, and the arbitrary judgments of local lords. The horrors of childbirth, as you heard, were universal, affecting all girls and women regardless of class, much like the case of Margaret Beaufort, who gave birth to Henry Tudor at the age of 13 and later advised against such early unions. But while her male siblings might face the battlefield, the abuse of heavy-handed tutors, or the arbitrary judgments of the law for poaching, the girls faced their own distinct battles. There's a certain grim solidarity in the shared experience of being a woman in a hard time, regardless of your birth. You see that empathy must extend across these class divides. The profound sadness you feel for Isabel Neville, who gave birth to a stillborn baby at sea while fleeing her father's rebellion, should also extend to the countless unnamed girls, peasant or noble, who found themselves in no man's land between warring armies, deserted in plague villages, or starved during sieges while trying to carry a baby to full term. Their specific challenges differed, but the underlying human experience of vulnerability, fear, and suffering connects them all. You are bearing witness to a spectrum of hardship, all equally deserving of your compassion. Having explored the nuanced variations of medieval child marriage across social classes, we now arrive at a critical, yet often uncomfortable, intellectual crossroads. the challenge of historical empathy. You're encouraged by historians to contextualize child marriage within its era, but how far does that go before it risks excusing or normalizing immense suffering? The mainstream historical fact is that while historical context is crucial to understanding past practices, a strict refusal to acknowledge universal human emotions and suffering risks dehumanizing historical figures and creating an artificial distance from their experiences. You're grappling with the tension between academic rigor and genuine compassion. Imagine being told that Joan of England's agonizing death from the Black Death, far from home and family, was just the will of God, and that her parents, Edward III and Philippa, weren't bad parents for sending her off to marry. This narrative, intended to prevent projection of modern views, can inadvertently minimize the very real pain involved. The psychological traumas of war on medieval children, for instance, were just as debilitating as for Syrian children today. Even if people didn't know about PTSD, it shaped their responses, their relationships, their outlook on life. It's like saying medieval pain didn't hurt because they didn't have painkillers, which is absurd. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some modern historical reenactment groups deliberately explore the emotional and psychological tolls of medieval life, pushing beyond factual accuracy to try and embody the mental states of the past, albeit with limitations. This experimental approach seeks to bridge the empathy gap in a tangible way. Historians still argue whether attempts to feel what historical figures felt are valid scholarly exercises or merely subjective projections that lack historical grounding. Is true empathy attainable, or are we forever separated by the chasm of time and culture? The discomfort you might feel about Richard II marrying 6-year-old Isabella of Valois, even if there was no suggestion of intimacy, highlights this dilemma. While her treatment by Richard's court was reportedly kind, and she mourned his death, the fundamental reality of a child being a political pawn, bringing her dolls to court, remains unsettling to modern sensibilities. The argument that times were harder then, and women's expectations were simply set at the level of helpmate and consort, can become a convenient shield, preventing us from truly acknowledging the deep, unexpressed longing for personal development, or agency that might have existed beneath the surface. There's a certain dark humor in the idea that we can analyze medieval tax records with detached precision, but shy away from the emotional landscape of human suffering. Perhaps the answer lies in a balanced approach. Yes, set child marriage into the context of its time. People died younger, and early marriage was a practical response for security and stability. Girls were not educated in the same way, needing a husband for provision. Dynastic alliances were essential, but also allow yourself to acknowledge the universal human emotions, the despair at lack of choice, the longing for lost childhoods, the fear of abuse and early pregnancy. We read the Declaration of Arbroath and feel the stirrings of liberty. So why deny that medieval mothers, sisters, and daughters might also have shared these emotions, even if silenced by convention? The act of not wanting to acknowledge these realities, of dehumanizing the experience to normalize it, might be a protective mechanism, just as we block out horrors in our own society. But true historical understanding demands that we look beyond the comfort and face the raw human truth. The profound tension between historical context and human empathy brings us to a crucial ethical consideration: how we interpret and validate the experiences of the largely voiceless. If the testimony of contemporary child brides is true and honest, should we not extend the same consideration to girls who lived long ago? The mainstream historical fact is that comparative history while problematic due to inherent contrasts, can offer vital insights by highlighting shared human experiences across different eras, demanding that we acknowledge suffering even when direct historical testimony is absent. You're arguing for a moral imperative to listen to the silence. Imagine a modern report detailing the trauma of girls, their feelings unacknowledged, their life experiences dismissed as unimportant. You would find that appalling, a profound injustice. Why then, when we look back at medieval child brides, do we often fall into the trap of sidelining their experiences, normalizing their suffering within a detached historical context? It's a fundamental question of compassion. Just because a medieval girl did not leave behind a written account of her anguish, does not mean she did not feel it. The lack of testimony should not equate to a lack of experience. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some contemporary scholars utilize fictionalized empathy or historical reconstruction techniques, where they craft narratives based on meticulous historical research, aiming to imaginatively embody the perspectives of marginalized groups for whom no direct records exist. This isn't about fabricating facts, but about filling in the emotional gaps. Historians still argue whether such empathetic reconstructions, while emotionally powerful, risk venturing too far into speculative territory, potentially blurring the lines between historical analysis and creative interpretation. Is it a legitimate tool for understanding, or a dangerous path to anachronism? You are arguing that the mentality of the men and women who rose in rebellions, who fought for rights, who were prepared to die for their faith, reveals a shared human desire for liberty and agency. If these powerful emotions existed for men, didn't their mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters also share them, even if convention forced them into silence? The idea that women were simply content to be the vessel for other people's ambitions, and instructed by the Christian Church to submit obediently to their lot, feels incomplete, a narrative crafted by those in power. Remember Marjorie Kemp's struggle for bodily autonomy, a powerful testament to the clash between personal desire and societal imposition. There's a profound, almost philosophical, irony in denying emotional complexity to people from the past when we readily attribute it to people today. This isn't about imposing your contemporary views onto the past in a simplistic way. It's about recognizing universal human dignity and the capacity for suffering. While you acknowledge that there will be those who disagree, who see child marriage as acceptable in their culture, or who dismiss any comparison between contemporary issues and the distant past, your argument remains firm. If modern voices of suffering are to be heard, then the silent cries of the past also deserve recognition. You can't change their experiences now, but you can bear witness to them, remember them, and in doing so, grant them a voice they were denied in their own time. As our journey through the dark truths of medieval child brides draws to a close, we find ourselves lingering on the enduring legacy of childhoods lost, of lives shaped and often truncated by the relentless forces of history. The mainstream historical fact is that the practice of child marriage in the Middle Ages had profound and lasting impacts on the physical, emotional, and social well-being of girls, contributing to a historical narrative where female agency was often severely limited. You are left with a deep understanding of the human cost embedded within historical expediency. Imagine the countless girls, like little Isabella of Valois, bringing her dolls to England, or Margaret Beaufort giving birth at 13, whose stories we've touched upon, and then consider the millions more whose names are forever lost to us, whose tears watered the medieval earth, whose dreams evaporated into the mists of time. Their lives, though seemingly distant, echo with a shared humanity that transcends the centuries. They felt all those things: confusion, fear, despair, frustration, anger, but their experience was largely ignored and sidelined in their own society, and no one thought to ask them or listen to their stories. A quirky or fringe tidbit, perhaps a poignant one, is that some medieval lullabies or folk songs, collected much later, occasionally hint at the quiet sorrows and burdens of early marriage, subtly weaving themes of longing for home or the weight of responsibility into their verses, a faint whisper of an unexpressed reality. Historians still argue whether the long-term societal effects of widespread child marriage, particularly the suppression of female intellectual and personal development, contributed to the slower pace of social change for women in subsequent centuries. Was it merely a personal tragedy or a societal impediment to progress? We can't do anything about their experiences now, not directly. We cannot unwrite the past, nor erase the hardships they endured. But what we can do, what you can do, is to bear witness, to remember, to read about a young girl in a historical account and, just for a moment, imagine what she might have been thinking and feeling about her life. You can hold her silent experience in your mind, not to judge her world by yours, but to acknowledge her as a fellow human being who navigated immense challenges. There's a profound act of respect in this remembrance, a way of giving voice to those who had none. This historical journey, this deep dive into the dark truths, isn't about wallowing in sadness or condemning an entire era. It's about understanding the complexities of human history, the choices made, the lives shaped, and the enduring resilience of the human spirit, even under the most constraining circumstances. It's about recognizing that even in societies vastly different from your own, the fundamental human experiences of love, loss, fear, and hope remain universal. Now, as the stories of these medieval child brides fade into the quiet hum of your room, let their silent courage linger, a soft echo in your thoughts. The whispers of the past are not meant to disturb your peace, but to enrich your understanding, to deepen your appreciation for the present, and perhaps to inspire a quiet gratitude for the choices and freedoms you hold. Let the heavy truths settle gently, like motes of dust dancing in a fading sunbeam. The long night is here, and with it, the calming embrace of rest. May your dreams be peaceful, and your awakening bring a renewed sense of connection to the vast, intricate tapestry of human experience, both past and present. Sweet dreams.